Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two disappearances that simply don't make sense. These are the types of stories that will make your head hurt because they're just so strange. One was even caught on video, but despite this, it's still a complete mystery to this day, and the video itself is just extremely weird. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Lorraine Ann Ron was born in Manchester, New Hampshire on April 3, 1966. We don't know much about her childhood, but her parents divorced when she was still an infant. Lorraine also didn't have much contact with her father growing up, and she and her mother Judith moved to Miami, Florida when she was just 4 years old because after the divorce, her mother wanted a fresh start. Things unfortunately didn't work out like she planned, and she and Lorraine would end up moving back to Manchester in 1976. By 4 years later in 1980, they lived on a third-floor apartment and Lorraine attended junior high a few blocks away. And despite the somewhat inconsistent home life, what was constant throughout Lorraine's life was that she was a dreamer and a free spirit, and she absolutely loved singing and dancing. She often even told her closest friends that she wanted to run away and make it big as an actress and performer. She was also close to her mother too, but like many people her age, unbeknownst to her mother, Lorraine began drinking and smoking while she was still in junior high. By the spring of 1980, her mother Judith was dating a professional tennis player, and as she often did, she planned to accompany him to an out-of-town match over the weekend on Saturday, April 26. Lorraine usually went with her mother when she traveled with her boyfriend, but that weekend she was on spring break, and she begged her mother to let her stay in the apartment by herself. Judith hemmed and hawed about this, but eventually agreed. After all, it was only a few weeks before Lorraine's 14th birthday, and she planned on getting back to Manchester early on the morning of Sunday, April 27th. It would just be one night alone. After her mother left, Lorraine spent most of the day in the apartment doing chores, watching TV, and talking on the phone with her friends. Several family members dropped by to check on her, and then that afternoon, she walked to a nearby liquor store to stock shelves. Lorraine didn't actually work there, but one of her friends said she occasionally did odd jobs around the store in exchange for free drinks. And in fact, she had a bottle of wine and a six-pack of beer when she got back to the apartment later that afternoon. Shortly thereafter, she called a male friend and a female friend and asked if they want to drink, hang out, and listen to music at the apartment. They were reluctant at first, but they said they'd be right over when Lorraine told them her mother was out of town and that they'd have the place to themselves. The three friends then spent the next several hours talking and listening to music, nothing really out of the ordinary. At about 12:30 a.m., they heard loud voices in the hallway. They didn't know exactly who it was, but it seems they all panicked and thought it was her mom coming home early. It seems that having a boy over late at night might get them in trouble, and her male friend either panicked and left out the back door or Lorraine told him to leave. Whatever the case, the boy also apparently heard the door locked behind him. Here's where things start to get weird. As it turns out, it wasn't Judith and her boyfriend in the hallway after all, but either way, Lorraine's male friend was long gone by the time she realized it was a false alarm. Judith and her boyfriend would end up showing up about 45 minutes later, but when they arrived, something was off. When they got there, the first thing they noticed was that the hallways on all three floors were totally dark. They initially thought the power was out, but after taking a closer look, they realized that someone had intentionally unscrewed all of the light bulbs. This was odd, but not necessarily alarming just yet. They initially suspected that it was some sort of prank or something, but then when they got to the apartment, they were surprised to find that the front door wasn't locked. Judith's boyfriend then immediately went to the back of the apartment while she walked to Lorraine's bedroom. At that point, she just wanted to make sure her daughter was okay and maybe to admonish her for being so careless. From the doorway, she saw a dark figure sleeping in her bed. Then moments later, her boyfriend walked down the hallway and told her that the back door was open. By then, Judith was more confused and a little annoyed about the unscrewed light bulbs and the open and unlocked doors. So to get to the bottom of it, she went into Lorraine's bedroom to ask her what was going on. At that moment, she realized the room smelled like alcohol and that the young woman in Lorraine's bed was actually her friend. The friend would then go on to say that she and Lorraine fell asleep together there sometime between 12:30 and 1 a.m., but for some reason, Lorraine took a pillow and blanket and went to sleep on the living room couch shortly after. This was obviously even more alarming because Lorraine clearly wasn't on the couch or anywhere else in the apartment. There weren't any signs of a struggle or a break-in, and it didn't look like anything of value had been taken, but panic slowly began to creep into Judith. Lorraine's friend said that she was wearing jeans, a blue plaid blouse, and a light-colored v-neck sweater earlier in the evening, which were still missing, but oddly, Judith found her purse and her shoes next to the living room couch. Judith then got even more panicked and began repeatedly asking the girl what happened and who else was there that night. The friend eventually told her about the boy who'd been there, but other than that, she said she was too intoxicated to remember anything. By then, Judith was fully panicking. Her boyfriend did his best to calm her down and suggested that she start calling friends and family members to see if Lorraine was with any of them. She wasn't, so Judith and her boyfriend eventually got back into the car and drove around town to see if Lorraine had gone out for a walk or passed out somewhere, but again, they didn't find anything. So by 4 a.m., Judith flagged down a police officer and told him that Lorraine was missing. Police officers began searching for Lorraine within the hour, and later that morning, investigators interviewed dozens of friends, family members, and neighbors to see if anyone knew anything. Investigators quickly cleared the two friends who were with Lorraine that night, but after hours and hours of interviews, the only thing they came up with was that she regularly told her friends she wanted to run away. Officers also visited a number of local businesses in the hope that someone would remember seeing Lorraine, but nobody had. Then, just when it looked like they reached a dead end, a bus company employee told them that he sold a ticket to a girl who looked a lot like Lorraine the day she disappeared. One of the company's drivers would even claim that she was on his bus and that she got off at the terminal in Boston, about 50 miles south. This was a potential game changer, but investigators were never able to determine if the girl was Lorraine or where she went after getting off the bus. In the meantime, the next few weeks were absolutely unbearable for Lorraine's family and friends. They still hoped that the bus company angle would eventually pan out, but when investigators eventually showed the driver a more recent picture of Lorraine a few weeks later, he said that the passenger in question might have been another young woman who just looked like her. So in the absence of any evidence of foul play, the authorities ultimately concluded that Lorraine finally made good on her promise to run away. They then assured her mother that most runaways came back within a week or two when they realized that life on the run wasn't as exciting or glamorous as they thought it would be. This definitely wasn't consolation to Judith because she never believed Lorraine ran away in the first place. They were just too close for her to do that without at least reaching out to let her know she was okay. And even if Lorraine had run away, her mother knew she would have taken her clothes, her purse, and her new shoes. As time went on, Judith knew that it was becoming increasingly unlikely that she'd ever see her daughter again. But then on October 1st, 1980, 5 months after her disappearance, she got a phone bill that included charges for 3 calls made from hotels in Santa Ana and Santa Monica, California. Since she didn't know anyone in or have any connection to California, Judith concluded that Lorraine must have made the calls. And after a little digging, she found out that the call from Santa Ana was made to a sexual assistance hotline for abused and exploited teens, many of whom were runaways. Judith immediately forwarded this information to the authorities, and a detective contacted the doctor who operated the hotline shortly thereafter, but he denied knowing anything about or having any record of the call. To add to the strangeness, sometime around this time, Judith began receiving mysterious phone calls, and these were extremely strange. She got most of the calls at approximately 3:45 a.m., and this continued for years, but the caller never actually spoke. Judith was initially sure that it was Lorraine because the call frequency increased during the holiday season, and later Lorraine's aunt also claimed that she got several calls from a young woman who asked her to speak to her son Michael. Lorraine's aunt said that the girl sounded a lot like her and that she called him Mike instead of Michael, just like she did when they were kids. Unfortunately, despite all these calls, several years later, Judith would eventually need to change her phone number, at which point the calls obviously stopped altogether. And for a time, there was no new information. Another couple years later, in 1985, an investigator with an organization called Wings for Children called the doctor who ran the same hotline charged to Judith's bill. This time, the investigator was able to get a bit more information, but found that he was sort of evasive in his answers. The man claimed that runaways and exploited teens occasionally visited the home he shared with his wife, and he even said that one of them may have been from New Hampshire. It's unclear why he changed his story, and his evasiveness was strange, but there wasn't much else that could be really done. This prompted the investigator to then visit the motels in Santa Ana and Santa Monica, California the following year to see if she could turn up anything new. She would then learn that one of the motels had allegedly been used as a filming location by an infamous videographer of minors known only as Dr. Z. Unfortunately, she was never able to confirm this, and the identity of the man has never been found. That same year, back in New Hampshire, a former childhood sweetheart of Lorraine's claimed that he got a mysterious call from a young woman who identified herself as Lori. He wasn't actually home at the time of the call, but his mother relayed the information, and he was sure it had to be Lori. But after that, the case just went cold. As with many of these cases, there have been a number of alleged sightings over the years, but none of them have been substantive. So, what we know is that Lorraine disappeared one night from her home in a short window between her friend leaving and her mom coming home. She didn't take any of her personal belongings that we know of, she didn't have any money that we know of, all the light bulbs in her building had been weirdly unscrewed, and maybe most troubling, her mother received strange phone calls for years, as well as charges from across the country linked to things that no parent ever wants to find out about their child. It was around 7 o'clock on the morning of January 21st, 2008 when a security guard at a Taiwan finance building showed up for work. As he entered the building, there was little reason for him to believe that this would be anything but an average day for him, but it only took a few steps inside the front door for him to make a discovery that would turn everything upside down. Inside one of the elevators was what looked like a neat pile of clothing on the floor, a highly odd sight for a building that prided itself on order and cleanliness. The finance building was one of the few truly modern-looking structures in the area. It was an 11-story blocky monolith that stood kind of awkwardly over the low-rise rooftops of its surroundings. It also housed high-income families and professionals, people who kept things tidy and quiet. Nobody just left clothing in the elevator, so, perplexed, the guard approached the items. There was one red jacket, a smaller pink one, and 2 pairs of shoes, both neatly placed. It was also winter, and the idea that someone had walked out barefoot, let alone with a child, was immediately disturbing. Still, accidents happen. Maybe someone moved out in a hurry during the night, and maybe they'd come back for them. That seemed like a reasonable conclusion, but something still ate at the security guard. He then made his way to the security office and flipped on the monitors that controlled the building's 13 surveillance feeds. And within minutes, he found what he was looking for, and what he found only furthered the confusion. The footage showed a woman stepping into the elevator with a little girl in her arms. She looked frantic, like she was in a rush, but didn't know why. As the elevator doors closed, she stripped off her red coat and then knelt to remove her daughter's jacket too. Then came her shoes, which she placed beside her. Meanwhile, the child just stood there, quiet and unmoving, as her mother then stared at the elevator panel for the rest of the ride. The woman in the footage also looked agitated and confused as she stared so intently at the changing floor numbers that it was like they were almost speaking to her. When the elevator reached the 11th floor, she picked up the child again and stepped out. A hallway camera then caught a brief glimpse of her turning left down a hallway and then entering a stairwell. The guard then checked the other camera feeds to see where the woman went next, but that's when his blood slowly began to run cold. There was no footage of the woman leaving the building with her daughter, and the only ways out of the building were well covered by the camera system. There was also no footage of her coming back down, no footage of her on any other floor, and nothing of her leaving. All that was left were the abandoned jackets and shoes in the elevator. When officers from the local police department arrived at the scene, the security guard wasted no time ushering them to the footage. He'd already queued up the clip from January 20th, just before 9 p.m. The elevator's interior camera provided a clear view of the woman in the video, later identified as a 37-year-old named Leo. She once again appeared in the frame, carrying her 4-year-old daughter in her arms, and her expression was impossible not to notice. She seemed tense and focused, and there was a hurriedness to her steps as if she were running late for something. She didn't pause to check her surroundings, she just moved straight to the elevator like she knew exactly where she was going. The elevator door slid shut, and then the behavior grew stranger as she removed the jackets and shoes and set them on the floor. When she was done, Leo wore only a white tank top and black vest, and she was barefoot despite the winter cold. There was also no one else in the elevator with the mother and daughter, and no indication of why she was behaving this way. The child was again silent and passive, either unbothered or too young to understand what was happening. Then moments later, the pair got off on the 11th floor, turned down the hallway, and entered the stairwell. Officers watched the footage again and again. It was deeply unsettling, not because of what they saw, but because of what they didn't. And just like the security guard, police found no trace of Leo or the child with her anywhere else in the building. It was like they disappeared into thin air. Within hours, officers were combing every floor and questioning residents. The building's architecture also made the situation even more maddening. It had a single monitored entrance and exit, and the elevator doors were locked down with keycard access between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m., a cutoff Leo had barely made. Every floor also had its own hallway cameras, and every stairwell had defined access. There were also no back doors or easy escape routes. This wasn't the type of place you could just slip out unnoticed, and yet there was no trace of Leo and her daughter. Officers then started their search at the top of the 11th floor, the last place the two were seen. Of the 4 possible units on the floor, only 2 were occupied, one by a Buddhist temple and another by a human resources agency. Police also questioned residents on other floors, but no one had seen or heard anything. There were no signs of any disturbance, no one heard unfamiliar sounds the night before, and there was nothing to indicate that a woman and her child had wandered through in the middle of the night. The stairwell also led upwards to the roof and downwards to the other 10 floors. Officers would go on to sweep every level, checking utility closets, maintenance shaft, emergency stairwells, anywhere a person could potentially hide, fit, or fall. They looked in ventilation ducts and storage spaces, above ceiling panels, and under floorboards. They then expanded their search, their surrounding blocks, hoping against hope that Leo had somehow gotten out of the building undetected, but there was no indication of that happening. Her motorcycle was also found to still be parked outside, exactly where she'd left it and untouched. The only confirmed sighting was from a teenage girl at the front of the building who saw Leo enter the lobby and approach the elevator just before 9 p.m. Neither the girl nor Leo exchanged any words during the brief encounter. There was also no overnight security guard on duty there. So next, after tracking down Leo's identity, police questioned her friends and family members, and what stood out most to them was that no one could come up with a reason why Leo would have been at the finance building at all. She didn't have friends or family who lived in the building, not even a passing acquaintance that anyone knew of. By the end of just that first day, the case had slipped from strange to surreal, and with nowhere else to turn, police started looking into Leo herself. To those who knew her, Leo wasn't the kind of person who would just vanish. She was a mother of 4 and a woman whose life revolved around her children. She came from modest beginnings in a rural part of the country, and she had been beautiful in her youth, so much so that she attracted many admirers. But her mother arranged a marriage for her instead, pairing her with a well-off local man who owned land and had enough money to provide a stable life, at least on paper anyway. After marrying, Leo settled into a 3-story home and took on the quiet life as a stay-at-home mother, as the couple had 3 children rather quickly. The man Leo was arranged to be married to, however, wasn't some wealthy Prince Charming that saved her from a life of poverty. He was instead allegedly violent and prone to bouts of heavy drinking and domestic rage. Her husband apparently made life at home a minefield, and eventually Leo had enough and divorced him. This was an act that in a conservative community like hers was met with raised eyebrows and a lot of gossip. Divorce wasn't common there, and it was an act that was looked down upon and harshly judged, but Leo couldn't take any more of her husband's outrageous and violent tendencies. Time passed afterward as the couple started their new lives apart, but her husband remained in the picture, hoping to earn Leo back. He swore he was a changed man, that he'd never drink again, and that he'd be a better husband, and so she gave him another chance. The couple remarried and had another daughter soon after, but it quickly became apparent that nothing had changed with Leo's husband. By 2008, she was for all intents and purposes a single parent, raising 4 children by herself while her husband drifted in and out of drinking binges. He was rarely home and often out at bars. The household income was unreliable too because of his drinking, and the debts were starting to stack up. The weight of all of this was starting to show too, and friends and family noticed that Leo seemed off in the days before her disappearance. Not just like she was tired and stressed, but more like unstable, like something inside her head had become unmoored. She wasn't sleeping well, and her moods shifted unpredictably. The night she vanished, she and her husband had another one of their loud arguments over his out-of-control drinking habits. Afterwards, she told her eldest daughter and her mother that she was going to visit a friend for a few days. She didn't say who she was going to visit, just that she needed to go. She didn't take her ID, wallet, or cell phone. She just grabbed her youngest daughter and left. In the absence of evidence, speculation flooded in. With no sign of Leo or her daughter anywhere in the building or outside of it, the police were left trying to build a narrative out of fragments. One of the earliest theories suggests that perhaps Leo, mentally fragile and overwhelmed, had taken her daughter to the rooftop with the intention of ending things. Police quickly determined that this line of thought was hard to support, though. The rooftop was thoroughly searched, and if Leo had jumped with her daughter, someone would have found them on the ground. But there was also no way off the roof that didn't lead straight back through the cameras. Another theory floated the idea that she'd had a breakdown and tried to discard her identity, hence leaving her ID, phone, and wallet behind. This, however, raised another question. If she did want to disappear, why bring her youngest daughter? This is where the whispers of a secret lover start to grow louder. Maybe Leo had been seeing someone in the building. After all, she did tell her eldest daughter and mother that she was off to stay with an unspecified friend for a few days. Maybe that friend lived in the finance building, but that theory didn't end up holding much water either. The building's longtime security guard had never seen Leo before, and there was no one in the building who admitted to knowing her. Friends of Leo also pushed back on the secret lover theory. Since her husband was always either at work or at bars, she was stuck at home with the children. Leo rarely had time to even leave the house, let alone begin and maintain some kind of secret affair. The most chilling theory, perhaps, though, was the simplest. That something happened to Leo inside that building, something no one saw or heard, and something no one has found any trace of to this day. Could she have encountered someone in that stairwell that took her and her daughter? But again, there's nothing on the security footage to support this. By 2013, the story had become something of a local legend. That year, local police decided to revisit the case in earnest. Maybe they'd missed something in the initial searches of the building in 2008, or maybe new eyes or newer technology could uncover something the original investigation didn't. The finance building was once again searched from top to bottom. Officers re-examined the unoccupied units on the 11th floor and questioned residents again, some of whom had moved in long after the disappearance, but nothing changed. In the end, the re-investigation turned up no fresh evidence, no new leads, and no potential suspects. If anyone in the building knew something, they weren't talking. If there was a secret path or a flaw in the surveillance coverage, it had evaded not just one thorough search, but 2, 5 years apart. Almost 2 decades have passed since Leo and her daughter stepped into that elevator and vanished. And all that remains is a handful of unsettling images burned into the memories of those who have watched the footage. In a building filled with security cameras surrounded by people and designed to be secure, a mother and her child simply disappeared. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. I also want to say thanks for all the incredible story suggestions that you've all sent in. There are so many fascinating stories that have now been covered on the channel that I never would have heard of if it weren't for all of you. Also, as a quick note, as the channel has grown, as you might imagine, it's gotten harder and harder to respond to all the messages across platforms. I actually tried for a long time to respond to everything, but it just become too difficult to keep track of everyone. So I'm sorry if you sent something in and didn't get a response. With that said though, the current best way to submit a story is through the story suggestion form in the description, and if you have any other general questions, sending me an email is the best way to get in contact. But anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.